Very welcome to the show. We are leading this morning on a rebel wake-up call to the Prime Minister. We were talking a lot about this just before Christmas, the Rwanda bill. It's a flagship policy for the Prime Minister. He was very keen to try and get it through the Commons. He managed to, without any votes against him from Conservative MPs before Christmas, perhaps surprisingly, given all the noise around the time. But now...
Well, yeah, I mean, interesting when they said, well, we'll all back it. However, what we want you to do is beef it up before the second reading. Well, now more than 30 Conservative MPs are backing amendments that would stop European judges and human rights lawyers from blocking those deportation flights.
Well, leading the rebels is perhaps surprisingly the former Immigration Minister, Robert Jenrick, who has warned that the stakes could not be higher for Britain.
So, as the bill returns to the Commons next week, just how much of a problem could this be for the Prime Minister?
He faces his first Prime Minister questions of the year today. It's likely to be a bit of a showdown for him. Let's get some analysis now from former Special Advisor to Michael Gove, Charlie Rowley. Very good morning to you. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning.
I suppose this was to be expected. We certainly got the impression that this was going to be kicked into the new year, these amendments. How likely is it that the Prime Minister will welcome them?
Well, I think he knows the strength of feeling on the backbenches and knows that there is a very strong view from a number of MPs who want the protections in place to be as strong as they possibly can be to make sure that those people that are deported won't have a case to be able to appeal. And what tends to happen when that does happen is that, you know, it goes on for days and days, weeks and weeks, months and months, and then it's the taxpayer that has to fund that hotel, it's the taxpayer that has to live with a group of people in the community who aren't quite sure whether they need to be there or not, or whether they'll be deported or they won't. So I think what the group of MPs who are opposing the emergency legislation that the Prime Minister's put forward is to make sure that it is as tight as possible, that those protections are all in place and that there cannot be appeals for people who are deemed for deportation.
I just wonder how the PM will handle this, because he did say previously, well, I think this is as tight as it can be. I've been working on it for years. But if you think you've got something that's going to work better, fine. Well, these MPs think they do. So will he listen to that?
Well, he's got a very tough balancing act to, or a tightrope to tread, really, because he's got this particular group of MPs who want him to go slightly further than the current legislation. He's also got the One Nation group of MPs who think that it goes absolutely as far as it possibly can. So who can he listen to? And it's about him now trying to, I think, pick off both sides to say, look, this is as far as it can go. Back the legislation. Let's not cause a Tory rift at the start of the new year, because divided parties don't win elections. And we know it's an election year. The Prime Minister confirmed that. His working assumption is there'll be an election at the second half of this year. So don't rock the boat in January 2024 so soon.
The Prime Minister's been quoted as saying, I'm open to bright ideas as long as they comply with our international obligations. Do you think these amendments do that? And if not, what's the point of making them? Because they'll only be rejected by the Lords, won't they?
I think that's absolutely right, and that's the tightrope that the Prime Minister's walking, because you've got to make sure that there is an effective appeals process in place, because there may genuinely be, and let's be perfectly honest about this, and I don't want to sort of sidestep the issue, but, you know, take the Post Office, for example. You know, it is a government agency that has been effectively wrong for years and years and years about the postmasters and postmistresses, about who it accused. Let's suppose, for example, the Home Office does get it wrong, and it does deport someone, or earmark someone for deportation, I should say, who shouldn't be. Of course there has to be a right to appeal. And of course, if you don't uphold your international obligations, then of course Rwanda will pull the plug altogether. So I understand the strength of feeling of those MPs who want it to be as tight as possible, to make sure that there cannot be this merry-go-round of a judicial circus where people do appeal and then they do stay in the country when they should be deported. But there has to be that balance between your international obligations and getting this policy right.
How much do you think this is going to be a Rwanda election? I mean, it's not as strong an issue as the last Brexit election in 2019, but is it going to be as big enough of an issue to actually direct things, really, when it comes to all the campaigning?
I think it will be, but in particular areas. And I think you're absolutely right. You know, it's not necessarily the number one issue that most people are talking about. They're still talking about the cost of living crisis. They're still talking about the NHS and the waiting list there. But it does play, obviously, very well in the particular seats that the Tories will need to hold on to if it's going to hold on to power and win the 2024 general election. And that's in the Red Wall, and that's in the North in particular.
Yeah, and if they want to neutralise the Reform UK threat, this is what they need to focus on, isn't it?
Exactly so, because it polls incredibly well with people that are tending to support reform, but also people that voted Brexit, people who voted back to take control of their money, their borders and their laws. And for so long, they haven't seen the government taking any action. So the Rwanda policy and things like, not in isolation, but things like with Rwanda, Bibi Stockholm, and the returns agreement that the government has got with Albania, all of those things add up to a policy that should be quite eye-catching and appetising for Tory voters.
The One Nationers are appealing to these 5 families, this rebel group, saying that compromise is how you win elections. Otherwise, the big winners in this will be Labour if people put their votes towards reform. Interesting group of people, this group of rebels in the 5 families. We talked about Robert Jenrick, obviously previously a close ally of the Prime Minister, now leading this very much. But in there as well, Danny Kruger. We'll be speaking to him at 8 o'clock this morning. But just this week, making headlines for saying that the Conservatives will face obliteration at the election. That's not going to help his case, is it, with the Prime Minister? The Prime Minister must be furious with him making headlines with those comments.
I mean, they're not ideal comments to make in a general election year. And I would just sort of appeal to people, like Danny, who would know, because I think he worked in Number 10. He was Boris Johnson's political secretary at times, at a particular time. But, under Theresa May in 2017, she saw the divisions within the party over Brexit. She saw that actually compromise, or tried to appeal to say that compromise is not a dirty word. Compromise is not something that should be sniffed at, because that's what brings the party together, what keeps the government, on the show on the road, as it were. And so I think, 2019 MPs, and there's a few of them, and, Danny's one of them, Miriam Cates is another, Jonathan Gullis, very, very strong local advocates who came in 2019 that might not have seen the division back in 2017, that might need to just sort of hold their nerve.
Just a quick one before we let you go for now. In terms of splits in other parties, they deny it was a split, but Richard Tice last week, from Reform, big speech saying, be very careful, you face Starmageddon, right? And then, of course, the PM said, well, a vote for Reform is a vote for Labour. Nigel Farage on Mark Dolan's show last night saying, well, of course Labour are going to win. Of course they're going to win, and they'll probably be in for 10 years. But this is all about this. This isn't about Reform winning the next election. It's a long-term plan. I wonder what impact that could have, because it sounds like they're arguing on different sides of the coin.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you hear these predictions all the time. It was supposed to be a decade of Boris we were supposed to have. And look, I remember when Theresa May was 20 points ahead in the polls in 2017. So anything is possible, anything can happen. But I think you're right. The campaign will be focused on, who's actually going to be the Prime Minister at the end of the day. It's either going to be Rishi Sunak or Sir Keir Starmer. A vote for any other party will let in perhaps an alternative through the back door, and you run the risk of voting for anyone else other than Labour or Conservative at the next election, and that might be a detriment to you, your vote, your community, your country.
OK, Charlie, we've got to leave it there, but hopefully we'll
much.
see you a little bit later.